My name is Deji Oluyadi. I'm a postdoc in clinical oncology at MedImmune and a Georgetown Liaison for GapSummit 2017. In the last decade, we've seen an emergence in innovative ideas from immunotherapy, which has shifted the cancer treatment landscape, which seek to further disrupt this landscape. However, we still have a pressing issue in biotechnology. These innovations are lagging. On average, it takes about 12 years and $3 billion for a medication to go from an idea to a patient. Essentially, the duration and cost of drug development is constantly rising and highlights one of the key issues facing the biotechnology industry: innovation. As the low-hanging fruits of innovations have been addressed, our focus shouldn't be on trying to retire in this innovation tree. Instead, it should be on finding ways to lower this innovation tree, and this includes addressing issues such as commercialization of scientific ideas, sharing of negative clinical trials data, and most importantly, collaboration. Fortunately, the discussion from our esteemed panel today, I think, is one step closer to achieving that goal. As you've heard in a previous discussion, Dr. Gutierrez and even one of our Idea Challenge mentors, Sandia, had alluded to some of the key issues facing us in the biotechnology industry. For example, as I said, drug development has this lengthy period, and again, it's innovation that is one of the key issues affecting it. As Sandy alluded to, collaboration is something that we in the scientific community can begin to embrace and develop. So without further ado, I'd like to start with an introduction to our moderator for the day, Dr. John Mumm. So Dr. Mumm is an immuno-oncology expert and is currently the Director of Research and Development in Immuno-Oncology at MedImmune. And at this point, I would like to hand over the mic to Dr. John Mumm. Please help me introduce him. Thank you.
So hi, I'm John. I've actually started a few companies. You were referring to the dogma. I actually developed a molecule that everybody thought was a suppressor. Turns out it's actually a specific activator of T cells to help tumors get rejected. So that's me. I do actually, before we introduce, I want to just share a few words in terms of how I think from our discussions we view what we're going to do today. So the distinguished guests and I are primarily focused on what we see as the greatest hurdles to barriers to innovation at large pharma, biotech, and academia. We'll share our experiences identifying bottlenecks to progress. In particular, I think we need to focus on improved strategies and tactics to help catalyze innovation and leverage our collective resources with regard to collaboration. We'll touch on the importance of innovative tools that facilitate the development of the next groundbreaking discoveries and implementation of the next disruptive solutions. And I know at MedImmune that's actually something we're very focused on. And I think we can all agree, really, that the types of experiments that we can conceptualize and implement today are categorically different than the types of experiments that we could all conceptualize when we first started our careers. And this has really been due to the relentless development of novel instrumentation platforms that let us delve deeper and deeper into the very nature of molecular interactions within biological systems. And I think, again, we need to leverage what we can do in academic institutions to understand and de-risk that aspect of the interactions. So I think with regard to I.O., it's recently become clear, and this is something that I think is particularly novel in today's time, is that with these development of immuno-oncology compounds, the wherewithal to actually cure human disease is oftentimes within the body itself. And that's a perceptual difference that I think has developed over the last 20 years in terms of harnessing what exists within our bodies to get rid of disease. And so as all of you consider your next steps in your careers, I think we hope that our experiences can provide a catalyst to your development as entrepreneurs. So.
Great. I'm Mike Stadnisky. I'm the CEO of FlowJo. So we make the leading software for single-cell analysis for both flow cytometry. We're used by every institute that's been mentioned today in the immunology space. We're very much involved in the early research of that and moving that into the clinic now. We just recently partnered with Illumina, and I guess in contrast to the timelines that we've been talking about, we went from conceptualizing single-cell sequencing and the analysis of that large stream of data and multi-omic workflows to a commercialized product in 9 months. So happy to talk about how that can be done. We focus a lot of our current effort on collaborations and facilitating, actually operationalizing multi-omic workflows and enabling people who actually do the experiment to do them, to share that data and to collaborate. So my focus is definitely on the instrumentation, on the tools and the provision, and also the environment that we can build around that data and that experience, again, to operationalize the kind of things that we're going to talk about on the panel today.
I'm Paul Silber. I started my career as a scientist, worked in industry for a number of years, then went on to get a bit bored, started my own company, sold it 15 years later. That was in 2006. Since then, I've been a very active angel investor, meaning early stage investor in a broad spectrum of technology companies. I think most people who know my background expect that to be primarily a bio background, but it's because of my background that I'm principally not a bio investor, in fact. So I'm fairly agnostic.
He knows too much.
I know too much. But I am focused on early stage technology. I do have a strong background in the life sciences, and so I bring that perspective today.
Good morning. My name is Luis Gutierrez. I started my career and have always focused on that yellow hurdle of health economic and payer considerations. And during that time, I've taken that knowledge further and further back in development, from launch to where I am today as an entrepreneur in residence at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, advising primarily academic innovators looking to make that translation and hopefully start a company and getting them ready such that if the science pans out, that's not where I help. Where I help is if the science is panning out, how can you build a business case that's going to impact the public health and be investable by guys like Paul?
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kuldeep Neote, and I am a Senior Director of New Ventures in the Johnson & Johnson Innovation Center. My background, I trained as a molecular biologist a long time ago, and I'm afraid to say how long because then you'll know how old I am. Needless to say that as soon as I graduated, I was very fixated on drug discovery, drug development, and very fortunate to do a postdoc at Genentech and in the heydays where biotech was really going up, and then could not refuse an offer by Pfizer and spend the next 10 years in Pfizer really focusing on small molecule drug discovery in the areas of inflammation and immunology. I have subsequently been at Eli Lilly, so it's been told to me many times that I have deep drug discovery expertise. And given that the pharma model R&D model was broken, I spent the last 4 or 5 years of my career actually doing external R&D and really looking at innovation in the external ecosystem and bringing that innovation then into the big pharma portfolio or pipeline. So my job really is as a search and evaluation role. We find opportunities and we line them up and champion them inside, in this case for Johnson & Johnson Innovation. And I hope during the panel discussion we can discuss what are some of the mechanisms that we pursue that allows us and enables us to leverage innovation that happens outside.
I'm Matthew Hall. I'm a biology leader at the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, which is part of the NIH. I have a traditional research background, except somehow my PhD was in chemistry, but I was always doing cell biology and worked at National Cancer Institute for 10 years and studying multi-drug resistance in cancer, and realized over the course of that 10 years that all I was really studying was our failure to treat a disease rather than studying the disease and how to improve therapy. So moved across to NCATS, where we really catalyze and work with collaborative partners to try and catalyze innovation and help people sort of buy into that concept of teamwork in science and everybody leaving their egos at the door. It was mentioned by Dario in that last talk. Working together and getting the right teams together to try and really pursue important goals for disrupting some of these diseases that we're failing to leverage.
Great. Thanks, gentlemen. So our first question then is, what are the greatest hurdles and barriers to innovation in big pharma, biotech, and academia? And I think we've actually started to touch on a few of those. Where is the bottleneck, and how do we improve our infrastructure to better support groundbreaking discoveries, innovative tools, and disruptive solutions? So whoever wants to go first, go for it.
Okay.
I guess my first observation is that the hurdle is one in which that I see every day is the siloism, or the fact that people are each touching one part of the elephant and seeing something very different.
Yeah.
A lot of the applications for research, I mean, you know, what's not to like NIH funding, non-dilutive, very early, doesn't have a real commercial endpoint, and is judged scientifically. So a lot of ideas get funded that are probably really cool science, but to impact the public health, it has to be a product someday.
Sure.
And a lot of them aren't even on a path there. And that's a recognition that my institute at Heart, Lung, and Blood has had, and why they're beginning. And we're still at the very early stage of bringing commercial sensibility and input, not only from USPTO, Kaiser, CMS, FDA, very early. You know, these are preclinical stage, to start giving some guidance and start weeding out some things that don't really have product potential.
Mm-hmm. So a question with regard to siloism. How much do you guys think that the siloism has to do with not leaving your ego at the door? How much of a good idea is actually the weight behind the good idea is the person that said it, rather than a grad student coming up and saying, hey, I think this is great, I did it 10 times and nine donors, it actually worked. What do you think?
I mean, I can say from our perspective, where we meet with many people from across academia, small biotechs that are looking for that sort of a public-private partnership for R&D development. Often there's a willingness and not really an understanding or knowledge about how to start that team, how to put it together. And so I think that as soon as people get a taste for how well team science works, the egos are left at the door.
Yeah.
I mean, when you really find out that there are other people in the room that just have really deep insight into parts of science that, frankly, it would take you years to get on top of it. And it's
Yeah, I
not
think
worth the
a
effort
good
to get there.
presumption is, don't think you're the smartest guy in the room.
Yeah, never.
The smartest
But
lady
there is
in the
one
room
question,
either.
which is, how do you find the people who should be in the room?
Right.
This is a huge problem, right? Whether it be the person who has that expertise or fits into a piece of the pipeline or is doing the best science. And when we've been doing this, that is one of the most difficult challenges. Not that they'll get involved, but who do I need to be talking to that is the expert, who brings what I don't have.
So is that an infrastructure question? I mean, how do you solve that?
It's both, right? So there's the technological challenge of who do I find that's outside of my institution that's very good at this. So in institutions, we're very good about that, right? And there's technology you can put in place to find who's the expert in my institution in this, right? But right now there's the monolithic wall of literature that we go out to, and we sort of cherry pick who we think is going to be the expert in the molecule of choice, right? And that's based on that, and unfortunately that comes with a lot of the baggage of what you just talked about. It's not the student who we're going to reach out to.
Right.
It's going to be the last author, and maybe they're not interacting or translating what's actually occurred in the laboratory into that team.
But is that our fault? There's a whole authorship list, right? And we choose. You say we choose the last author. That's the person who brought the money. I get all that.
No, it's the person who got published in the journal that the person who's assembling the team respects.
Sure.
Right?
So can we do a better job at actually looking at the first few authors?
Yes, and also figuring out within that, effectively, if you can, I mean, right now we could go out and find people who live in Wisconsin in a particular county who like cats, who bought a BMW last year, but we can't do that for cancer research.
So do you think it's a function of Google not having the right search terms, or is it?
No, I think it's the scientific community. When we publish, we're not engaging at a level that actually allows us to figure out what we are actually all doing and what our actual expertise is.
So is that a question that as you develop more novel technology, say CyTOF, no one in the world is an expert at CyTOF right now. There might be a few people that argue, but it's a brand new technology. It's terribly challenging to set up, right, et cetera, et cetera. We're setting one up at Medi, right?
Yeah.
It's a nightmare, like every single new innovation is.
Absolutely.
Right? So how do you get around that? How do you find the best person?
So I think part of that is sort of operationalizing that again is where are people submitting the profile that allows them to be the person who addresses your particular pain point. Because the other part of this is when we talk about publications, we're also missing the other people who are in the core laboratories and other people who facilitate the science who actually aren't even Googleable because we didn't know that they were critical to the experiment.
Right.
But the person who's running the CyTOF at Dana-Farber, who is the expert in running the CyTOF, is not someone you will ever find right now. So I think one of the things that we're missing is actually team assemblers where people have profiles and say, this is what I am best at. so that we can actually go out and find that one key individual. Because invariably on these teams that are being created, it's the critical conversations and those connections that are made. Because everyone says, oh, this is a people business. Everything is a people business, right? It's humans that are operating the experiment and deriving the insight from it.
So then,
John, if I may interrupt, instead
you.
of going down the weeds, I hate to do this, but let's just take a step back and really go back to your question of really what are the hurdles and barriers to innovation in big pharma. So let me just sort of steer the discussion, if you don't mind, away from, again, the big pharma perspective. And I will talk about that in the context of silos, because that's what you brought up initially. I think there was a mentality, maybe 5 years ago, that it's only pharma that can truly discover and develop drugs, okay? And there was that silo within the pharma. I was at Pfizer, and that was very prominent, that if we don't do that assay that was published, right, in whatever Nature journal or Science journal, and do it and reproduce the data, then it's wrong. And some of that had some merit, right? And I think that mentality was perhaps what was a barrier, in really thinking out of the box and getting innovation. And I think, Dario, you said it, to really challenge, right? And not say no. That, look, I believe in this innovation and I want to really pursue it. And I think that's what has changed perhaps in the last 5, maybe 10 years. And certainly, Tony gave a very good example of how Pfizer's CTI initiative, right, is really trying to do that. They are embedding in innovation, high innovation clusters in the Bay Area, in Boston, and other cities. And they're very open in inviting academia and really opening up the notion that innovation can come from anywhere. Okay?
So breaking a silo, or perception of a silo.
Breaking the silos. I think other examples are incubator facilities. I think incubator facilities are a very good example where, in a very sort of an open environment, open access that we see today, where companies come in, several companies come in together. And we were amazed at J&J. We have our incubator facility, J Labs, where we incubate anywhere from 20 to 30 companies at one point. And it's just amazing how you would think that companies, biotech companies, would protect their IP and would be afraid to talk. Okay, they would kind of go into a shell. Well, they don't. The amazing thing that happens is that those walls come down, the silos come down, because you've created an environment where companies actually talk to each other. Yes, they are mindful about their IP, because that is their jewels, right? You don't want to throw your baby out of the bathwater. But they recognize that if they start having a conversation that someone is developing chicken antibodies, and they have a chicken antibody platform, and who would have thought that perhaps, when you try to raise antibodies in chicken, you get a huge amount of diversity, for example, that they wouldn't have thought otherwise had that chicken antibody platform company being in an incubator facility. So I think it's very interesting, and we can talk through a list of initiatives that other, at least big pharma, are doing to try to break those silos. Okay, Sanofi, for example, if you don't mind, I'll digress, and I know Paul is waiting to make a comment here.
Yeah, exactly.
And he's not. Sanofi is a good example. They have this Sunrise initiative where they've cordoned off venture money that they invest very, very selectively in areas where they feel they're going to have an impact. Okay.
But does that define a breakthrough, or is that, again, right, getting back to how do we drive a breakthrough versus how do we drive some well-funded person's idea?
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like where is that synergy? How can these folks that are rising entrepreneurs, how do they harness that? Do they go sit in an incubator and listen to people talk, or how do you actually crystallize that?
So I'll give you my personal opinion about what a breakthrough is, and how potentially you could go after the next blockbusters, and Dario, we can talk about that certainly. So I think it's fairly known now that as we are pushing back the frontiers of science, that there are incremental steps that are taken in our understanding of a particular biology or a pathophysiology, right? And over the course of time, those incremental changes at one point hit a breaking point, and you get some sort of a breakthrough. right?
So that's right time, right place.
Okay, and it's a matter of having the right people at the right place at the right time, some luck, right? To really get to the point where you come across a breakthrough therapy. And we can talk about very interesting examples. I'm fascinated with digital health today, right?
As are many large
Okay,
pharma.
as are many of them, and I'm sure some of the investors sitting here probably think about that all the time. And I think there's no question that the concept of how you can monitor your well-beingness, okay, through wearable devices that are hooked up to your iPhone that somehow get uploaded to the cloud and get analyzed through very sophisticated AI-focused analytical sort of tools, and then tell you that look, you might be getting cancer in another 10 years or 5 years, right? Is just amazing. But they are incremental, okay, advances that are being made. We don't really understand now, how that really is going to happen. Okay, we might be pursuing, companies that are pursuing nanosensors, right? That I'm willing to predict are going to be embedded in your body that are monitoring various abnormalities.
So actually, I want to hear from a few of the other panels because I want to
Sure,
capture
absolutely.
that. So from an angel investor perspective, what are you looking for or in context of a nanotech, or what kind of proof of concept do you need to have in order to then or to convince you to put X amount of money in to think about developing an idea further?
That's a great question. We like to say we bet on jockeys, not on horses. So early on in my investing days, I fell for the same mistake that all early stage investors make, and that is we fall in love with the technology, we fall in love with a huge market, and we almost completely ignore the guy who's running the show. Because really, the best technology in the world, the biggest market in the world means nothing. Nothing will ever happen if you don't have really great processes and great execution. It's all about execution. And I think the same truly applies to pharma. I spent a lot of time inside of Big Pharma. They bought, I sold to 48 of the top 50 large pharma worldwide. And I'm sure, and I cannot lump everyone in together, but even they would complain to me that, and I primarily sold on the preclinical side, that preclinical doesn't talk to clinical, discovery doesn't talk to preclinical. So if you want to talk on a macro scale about silos, they're the big silos.
Sure.
And the incentives, I think, are not aligned with the desired outcome. The desired outcome is to have good and great drugs, not just everything be a blockbuster, but also some good, some $250, $500 million a year winners. You don't have to have multi-billion dollar every single drug. You can build a nice portfolio that way. But I still think that the industry suffers from a lack of respecting basic business processes that every other business would be dead if they didn't do. I think that fundamentally is a huge problem with pharma. It's just principally because pharma is run by scientists. Most of us here are scientists who worship at the altar of science, but should equally worship at the altar of basic execution of business processes.
But do you
So Paul, I agree with you, if I may. I'll just, I think you make a very important point in the connection between perhaps what is the unmet clinical need, okay, the commercial, and at the end of the day, pharma, biotechs are there to make money, the commercial value of that, and connecting that all the way to drug discovery, right? To discovery in the sense that you can really have much more efficiency in translating that, right? And I think that is the key. And sometimes in discovery, you're a scientist, you're so focused on your biology, you lose sight of what that unmet, what does the patient truly want?
Right.
With the complexities of what the payer environment is, and is it fair to pay $300,000 for an opportunity? But I think that's a very important point, is that commercial aspect.
So a question then, just really quick. So I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and the cycle time for a new widget or a new app is very fast because you are adherent to the marketplace. In drug discovery, we have a 10-year life cycle, right? And the challenge that we have is that, say, for oncology, patients are actually dying, literally dying, to get our compounds. So we don't feel that same pressure, right? That's not how our system is built. We're based on the science. we're not thinking forward enough. And you had mentioned earlier that for a preclinical or discovery aspect, maybe you shouldn't be thinking about that, and I completely concur. I've spent a lot of time doing basic discovery. But the flip side of that is that we don't exert the same pressure on ourselves. What do you guys think about that? And actually, Luis, can you chime in?
Yeah, I think that, and building on Paul's point, the silos in pharma, because they're so real, has led to this disintermediation of pharma, the outsourcing of big parts of the enterprise. Discovery is, with due respect to pharma, is no longer what big pharma does,
Right.
and nor should they. There's a whole capitally backed there. Even the development is something, a service you can outsource. The manufacturing you can outsource to people who do this for a living and have to compete on how well they do it.
So you build efficiencies based on making an open marketplace.
Absolutely, and that's much closer to your Silicon Valley model.
Well, it's a bit quicker. Yeah, I think the model of the pressure that you have from the market space to actually learn and adapt. And as scientists, I don't think we necessarily think about adapting so much. We say, oh, that didn't work, and we'll do it again, and that didn't work, and we'll do it again, and it still didn't work. Well, maybe we'll shift the experimental parameters a little bit.
Yeah, I've never heard someone use the word pivot in a drug discovery
Right.
context, right? Like, well, that wasn't working, but we talked to the clinician, and so we pivoted further, right?
Right.
I haven't heard that, at least yet.
Right.
But
that actually,
I'm actually starting to hear it in some of our discovery hubs.
Okay.
And after the second, third pivot, it's like, stop.
that's a circle.
So I'll give another reason why I think that urgency really is not there, at least in big pharma. So, I think in terms of accountability and having resources, and I dare say endless resources, because that's not entirely true, but there's some truth to that, I think prevents at least big pharma to really move things faster. Now you contrast that with a young entrepreneur, okay, who's got a startup, or a startup company. They have limited funds, limited resources, okay, and they have to be so careful, and they have to really do that killer experiment to make things work. So there's almost a hungerness, okay, which is, I believe, in many cases absent in pharma, okay, that is present in that sort of innovative ecosystem in the biotechs and startups and the entrepreneurs, who are first-time entrepreneurs, right from academia. And I think that hungerness really drives, okay, you've got limited resources, financing, you've got a limited time frame, and you've got to create value in the work that you're working. Because if you don't, you're not going to get the next investment. And we believe that's one of the fundamental drivers of early success. So you get many failures, right? I mean, you do. And that, I would urge all the entrepreneurs would be out there to take those failures and continue to go back and do something else. If you fail in one venture, if one biology isn't right, okay, and we heard Tony, his passion about asthma and eosinophils, you go to another biology, and you keep that passion, that hungerness, burning, and you do it again, and you're going to fail again, and you do it a third time, and you're going to fail a third time, and don't give up. And hence the word serial entrepreneurs is I think, what the key is.
So for the jockeys that you bet on, what's your expectation or what's your tolerance for their failure?
We expect most of them will fail. And in fact, we specifically like to bet on those who failed before and learn from it. And for those for whom it's their first foray into this, we really spend a lot of time measuring character, risk tolerance, ability to admit and move on from failure, learn from failure. And I think that is a real issue. I think it's a huge issue. I think it's a huge issue in pharma. I mean, when there's no risk to failure, there's no pressure. When one can do an experiment as many times as one wants before moving on, that's a problem. And you see that a lot.
Yeah.
And the kinds of companies that I invest in don't have that luxury. They have to, as you said, they've got a finite amount of money. There's a term we use, not just pivot, but runway. Runway means, okay, you spend $100,000 in cash a month, you've got $900,000, you have 9 months to live. So from now to 9 months, you had better deliver some real value. You had better move the ball forward or you're done.
We've heard the term, you need to act like a fruit fly.
That's right.
I think, there's one thing we can talk about is how do we lower the failure rate? Because I agree, most people will fail on those things. I accept that. But there are, in that pre-competitive space, I think there are significant cultural changes that can take place across the industry to try and help people fail less. And I think the thing that really brought it home for me is that, I won't say the target, but I've spoken to 4 different large pharma companies and several small companies in the last 18 months about the same target. And 3 of those large pharma companies told me they all walked away from it because they couldn't de-risk it genetically. So they couldn't demonstrate that there wouldn't be unacceptable toxicity. 3 different companies went through exactly the same process, and the other ones that didn't or tried to de-risk it a different way are going to fail later after spending even more money trying to get to the same place on the same target. And that's pretty competitive. And I think finding those opportunities for small and large industry and pharma to make people aware of things like genes that have been de-risked, small molecule strategies that haven't succeeded, gives other organizations the opportunity to chase other targets. It would at least be nice if we were all failing on completely different things instead of in our silos for acceptable reasons from a business
real
point of view.
failure, not failure due to lack of communication.
Yeah, and not failure on the same thing. It'd be nice
Yeah,
if we were failing on
I would also say, though, admitting that all of this will have a high failure rate no matter what target you're going after.
Yeah.
That's just a given.
Yeah.
That really the industry should move more towards what the insurance industry does. If you look at the big insurers worldwide, they say, you know what, okay, we wrote this policy, but we're not going to own all of it. We're not going to risk everything on there not being a hurricane in Florida in the next 10 years. We're going to share this policy with others. And so they sell it off. They have 8 or 10 other competing insurance companies go and buy a piece of that.
So a different definition of collaboration.
Absolutely, they share the risk. I mean, imagine if you had, Lilly and Pfizer and all these other companies that said, you know what, look, we're going after a tough target. There's a high failure rate. Let's really collaborate. There are really different models that could be employed where this solution already exists in a different industry.
All right, so I think that concludes our discussion on the first question. We have time for a few questions. So a few questions now.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Chad Seinsman. I'm a PhD student here at Georgetown. And I wanted to just get your opinion a little bit. I agree that there's a lot of siloism, but I think that if you're just thinking about it in terms of a big pharma company, it may be a little too late to solve that problem. And so what do you think could serve as some good initiatives to start earlier? Like personally, programs like this, like the GapSummit, or in graduate school, maybe communicating or linking up the scientists with MBA students earlier or something like that.
The NIH has one program that addresses this at the graduate training level, where they actually so it's a biotechnology training program. You're actually brought together with a team that looks like a pharma team. It's chemi, it's people from the clinic, it's basic scientists, and learning to try and talk across that kind of barrier when you're still doing your science, I think is one way of getting there. Because you effectively get onto a team where you're forced into, you're not collaborating on the same project because you don't have time for that, right? You have to make your paper and that's the model. But at least you're forced to be in a team to be able to translate what you're trying to do to someone who doesn't know what an NK cell is.
And doesn't really care.
And doesn't care at all.
It's a great question. I would say, so all of us in science learn at some stage of the game how to talk, give a presentation. We all learn how to write. Those are the essential skills, right? How to design an experiment, how to write a paper, how to give a talk. And then you move on from there. But I think another really essential skill, if you're going to be in industry, is learn the essentials of project management. Just learn these, and you don't need to go to school for it. You can self-teach, you can read, you can do whatever you want to do. But so much of what we're talking about, so much of collaboration is essentially project management. How do you take this distributed set of resources? Resources can be people, core laboratories, technology, anything, and weave it together to come up with a desired end result. They don't teach that as part of graduate school. I think they really should.
I think they actually teach the opposite, in the sense that you are expected when you go through your orals or when you defend your thesis to be the lone voice in the wilderness that's actually really polling for this idea. What you're talking about, and I totally concur with, and by the way, thank you for the question, the first premise that it's already broken in pharma and it's not fixable, I take some umbrage with. No, I think you bring up a good point, and it's actually, I'm 9 months at Medi. That's one of the first things that I've done with the entire groups of my teams is to bring them all together so they start talking together. And then the point is, what is the goal? We all have to be pulling in the same direction. If we're all pulling in the same direction, that takes leadership skills. You need to be the champion, right? And they tried to beat it into you when you were doing your orals and your thesis in a kind of a backwards way. But it's all about being the champion, right? We talk about that a lot in pharma, but it really is. You need to be the person that is capable of convincing everyone in the room that this idea is great. And it's not based on your ego. It's not based on how handsome you are, or how tall or short, anything. It has to do with the data. You drive the data in such a way, and if somebody asks you a question, you say, gee, that's a great experiment. I'm going to go do it. Right? It's all about being a person, in my opinion, and you guys have your opinions as well, that you're willing to be the person that goes to the mat, that gets it done, and that you show by your efforts, by your leadership, that these things can happen. And you'd be shocked at how quickly people jump in line behind you to make things happen.
So I'll give the pharma perspective. So first, to address your questions, I think something that Paul, you might have alluded to. There are certain things that pharma, from a project manager, collaborating to do something and actually getting it done, okay, really, really efficiently does happen in pharma.
Yeah.
Question is, where does it happen? It happens when you're very close to the clinic. And then the processes and the project teams that are assembled to do that, okay, and what you need to do to get to the clinic, do your phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. No one does it better than pharma. We can argue about phase 1, but certainly phase 2.
Yeah, phase 2, 3, for sure.
No one does it better than pharma. Everything that we've spoken about in terms of working together as a team, leaving the ego outside and coming into that room when things have to get done, milestones have to be met, a certain budget is allocated to get that through phase 2, you got to get it done, right? Okay. I think the difference here, the key issue here is that the early stage, okay, of drug discovery, where true innovation, no question, happens, right? The rules are all out of the window, right? You know, and how do you enable that, I think, is the key question. For us sitting in pharma, how do you enable that? You don't go in there and tell, you know, someone who's a recent PhD graduate who has a fabulous idea, be it an instrument, a technology platform, to put that into place. You don't tell that person, we believe in Johnson & Johnson innovation, how to do it, right? There's no rules, I believe, you know. You enable that innovation, that entrepreneurship mind, you know, that inventor to take their discovery to some sort of a point where investors become interested, where pharma get interested. Okay, so our fundamental principle, again, to address your question, you know, it's too late for pharma. It's not too late. Our principle is you let that inventor do what they want to do, okay, but you enable them. We provide J Labs as incubator facilities. We're there, okay, sitting on the front row. If they want help, we're there to give them help. If they want to understand what is that unmet clinical need, what is the commercial value, what is the regulatory pathway to get, you know, whatever you're working on through, we are there. So I think we need to think differently about how to do that early discovery, resources, investment, risk, how you de-risk it. We spoke a little bit about how you share that risk. You give a fabulous example, you know. I think pharma is, in some ways, at least J&J is, coming up with ways of sharing that risk, okay? And you have to balance it. I don't want to sidetrack the conversation, but there are certain things you cannot share. When you're generating intellectual property, that's going to be the jewel and the value of your company. You can't share that, okay? However, the flip side is it's much more complicated, okay? Only 20% of the patients who are on immunomodulatory therapy, okay, benefit, okay? There is no question that companies like Merck and BMS and Genentech, Roche, who have these immune checkpoint inhibitors in the clinic, are learning a lot about why those 80% of the patient, 85% of the patients are failing. I wish there was a mechanism where that knowledge could be shared so that anyone who's sitting out, okay, in the left field sees something in there and says, oh my God, I think I have an idea, and I want to, pursue that idea. I think, we need to do something about that, where that type of knowledge, that type of insight is beneficial in how we can collaborate. Developing biomarkers to look at disease progression. Diseases like osteoarthritis, which, to test a drug takes years and years and years and is very expensive. Can we collaborate to develop biomarkers that would allow us an early indication that a compound is working or not working? How can Big Pharma collaborate? I know there are some NIH initiatives on developing biomarkers from, by establishing a consortia and having all the companies contribute their understanding of clinical data that's coming out. I think these are the initiatives that are going to be really important for us to work.
And can I add one thing to that? I mean, I think from you in a room with an idea point of view, I mean, I think the two things you've got to do, and I might be preaching to the choir a little bit, given why you're all here, but networking is really obvious, and just not, dropping your shame and just telling your story and pitching your idea to everyone you talk through. So if you're a molecular biologist, don't keep talking to molecular biologists. That's just an echo chamber, right? You're just going to talk about the same science and biology to the same people. Try and, you've got to go to places, whether it be biotech networking, university seminar series, where you're going to grand rounds and meeting clinicians and talking to doctors and nurses. Where you go to business networking events where you're talking to angel investors and people who want to invest, so that you've got a spectrum of people within your contact network who can give you insight and can bounce off different aspects of the industry that you don't necessarily have insight into. I mean, I think that's really the critical thing, just talking to as many people as you can through conferences and networking events and scientific interactions.
Well, and just to add one thing, I think really listening to what potential detractors have to say, right? So a negative in your story isn't personal, right? It's something that person is bringing to you that is an issue that they found in one or more companies or people that they dealt with. Really listen, right? Because those critiques are the ways that you can solve and make your system better, your story better, right? Always listen. I think we have time for one more question.
Gentlemen, thank you for your candor and your reflections. My name is Chris. I'm a medical representative in the marketing company for AstraZeneca's Australian division. My question was almost where Kuldeep was headed in the last reflections there, and I'm interested, Paul, on your comment around the insurance industry sharing risk or finding opportunities to share risk. I'd love maybe your thoughts on how pharma has done really well to cultivate these networks and look for biotech companies to foster innovation with. But there seems to also be a sense of duplication or unnecessary duplication. And I kind of think back to what you've talked about with checkpoint inhibitors, and the fact that we have 3 diagnostics that aren't necessarily all concordant with each other. Where can we find in this race to be the first an opportunity not just to share the risk with biotech companies, but more importantly, probably across Big Pharma, and to say, can we use a consistent platform across all therapeutics and share the wins? And more importantly, how can we be a part of promoting that? Is there an opportunity for young researchers to work with other young researchers from another Big Pharma company and share what excites them, and potentially work together to find a narrow space where we can share the wins? And I'd like to just hear your insights on where you think you might have seen that work and where we can do more to try and force that across Big Pharma and research.
Well, that's a few questions. Before any of you were born, all of us remember there was a race for the standard. Would it be beta or VHS? Anyone in the audience know what I'm talking about? No. A couple of gray hairs back there. But truly, I mean, there were all these electronics manufacturers who were trying to say, trying to establish the standard. And ultimately, VHS won because there was a collaborative group of industry executives across different companies who got together and say, this is what we want. Well, let's all agree on this. This will be the standard. We'll all make our competitive VHS machines, but we'll all follow the same standard. I don't know why that model can't work in pharma. at all for biomarkers, it would make an awful lot of sense too. And then if there would be an organized effort, yes, we need biomarkers for whatever the target is, and let's do it, and let's contribute resources, meaning people, and let's figure out how we're going to make that happen, because we all need it, and we all have an opportunity to win. I think that, the model has certainly been done in other industries. It could be done in pharma. I haven't really seen it done much.
Yeah, I mean, the closest I can think of is Translational Bio,
There.
but that's really in standardizing processes and approaches to clinical development.
Right.
This would be a preclinical or a biomarker analog to Translational Bio.
Yeah, so I'm just going to answer that one part of the question, but I think the model absolutely exists. It's been done before in other industries. There's no reason it can't be done. It just takes, frankly, a courage of leadership. Not just at the executive level, but you said, could you and your peers do it? Absolutely. Why not? I mean, I think if you can establish a model, get together with you're with AZ, get together with partners at other competing organizations and say, here's a problem. Make a case and sell it.
I'll make a comment just to drill down further. I think the key is, how do you incentivize, right, individuals or that individual who would take that sort of leadership role in pulling something together like that to do it, right? So everyone is incentivized by different things, but the key incentive is money. Let's be very, very, very honest about it, right? Well, I know you're right, absolutely. There are people who really want to help the patient, okay, but it's different for everyone. But the key is, okay, if you can set up some sort of an incentive to really develop that magic biomarker, okay. A good example that comes in the area of immuno-oncology is, can you have non-invasive imaging to look at the T cell infiltrate, right, in the tumor microenvironment, that would right off the bat tell you who that 20-30% is that's going to benefit from therapy, right, and focus on that. Okay, simple concept. How do you set up a scenario to incentivize that? I don't have the answer, and I don't know what we can learn. Maybe the panelists can share some of their experience pulling a consortium perhaps, or a group of individuals, okay, getting it de-risked by getting funding from BMS, Merck, et cetera, okay. It's a huge undertaking. And I honestly don't know the answer of how someone sitting out there would start something like that. And
I'd also say read a book about negotiation, really. I mean, This is what you're talking about, right? You learn project management, but also learn the basics of negotiation.
Right.
You do negotiation all day long. I mean, frankly, all of us do. And it is an underestimated skill.
Yep.
You negotiate for everything you want, for everything you're going to get, and for how to really structure win-win, truly win-win. All we're talking about is a win-win collaboration among multiple parties. How do you structure that?
Yeah, and in this particular case, with regard to BMS, where I have lots of friends, and I worked at Merck in the early days of developing, this is really a market-based perception right now, in the sense that BMS wants to treat everyone. Merck was behind strategically. They wanted to get into the market, and so they very logically figured out the best way to target the tumor is if your target is in the tumor, right? So logically, it makes a lot of sense. BMS is still fighting against that, and I think that it really takes everybody to sit back, and it's a definition of win-win. Who is winning? The patients are winning, and guess what? We are a lot closer to needing these compounds than you are, so it actually behooves us in a lot of ways to actually make sense of this, right? But right now, it's predicated on money, and it's unfortunate that that's the case, but there's such huge sunk costs in the development of either of those therapies that they have to figure out a way to monetize it, right? So that's the challenge.
So if you want a sort of an optimistic preclinical example, go and look up the Structural Genomics Consortium. It's funded by multiple big pharma companies. The Structural Genomics Consortium does everything from crystallography through to assay development. It's an open science-based platform, so they're paid by pharma to do this research, but they make everything available to the wider scientific community. And part of the reason they do it is that they consider it to be the pre-competitive space. And I think if you flip it to the other extreme end, I mean, everyone's watching CAR T trials right now, where people are dying in multiple CAR T trials, and you really hope someone somewhere is talking to someone somewhere else about whether there's commonality and why that's occurring, while they're all racing to be that. I think Novartis is probably going to win, but to be that first company that gets to registration.
Right. All right, so we have two more kind of short questions that we'll address in the next half hour. And those are, which strategies or tactics can we adopt to improve collaborations between governments, academic institutions, and industries across the world? And this really comes out of the idea from the space enterprise, where there's such massive barriers to entry, to building rockets, to putting people outside Earth orbit, et cetera, that they actually need to share risk. They need to figure out how to do that. So the International Space Station is a great example of how nearly every nation that has any GDP, that's above a couple dollars per person, is trying to facilitate the ability to participate in the program. And I think it's very nebulous as to what the actual return on investment would be. Right? In our industry, we actually know what the ROI is. In space industry, if you look at NASA, there was a huge amount of technology that was discovered that the US has benefited from. Russia has benefited from their own program. We're still trying to figure out how to do that with the International Space Agency. So how to, using that as a model, or maybe making it better, how do we figure out how to improve our collaborations? And then the second part of this is, how do we catalyze innovation? And I think we've touched on this a little bit, but we've never really nailed down into what is the catalyst to innovation through use of effective resources, fruitful collaborations, and partnerships. So we're going to take about 20 minutes to discuss this, and then we'll have 10 minutes for questions. Who wants to drill in? How do we crystallize how to drive innovation?
So I'll give a little bit of sort of a commercial on Johnson & Johnson innovation concept or model.
Nope, not allowed.
Just a little bit, just as a discussion point. Okay. So we've put together this concept of J&J innovation, where we focus on very early stage collaborations and partnerships, and making investments in that space. And the key thing that we have focused on, in terms of strategy of how we want to play in this space, and we do think about all the time, what we want to do in that space, is to let the innovation happen outside and not to bring it in, okay? So we're sitting, I sit in the Innovation Center in Boston, okay, right in Candle Square in Cambridge. And I look around myself and I see huge buildings that Pfizer is in. I see huge buildings that Novartis is in, and Merck is moving in with, a building, and J&J Innovation is an office, okay, no more than 20,000 not even 20,000 square feet, it's probably about 15,000 square feet. And the idea is not to build labs, but to leverage the innovation that happens outside of the ecosystem, and then to do whatever we can to enable that innovation. But then at the right time, to partner where we are indeed going to make a difference in accelerating that innovation into the clinic. Okay, so to capture some of what you were talking about, John, this is J-Labs is one, our incubator facility is one example of how we enable that, how we encourage those collaborations. We're partnering all the time and being very open about what it takes, okay, to take ideas, fail fast. If you're succeeding, how do you invest more money in it? And what other resources can you employ to make it happen? And it's very, very interesting experiment in how we see that things, happen. And I would be the first one to say, no rules. You throw the rules out of the window, and you let that innovation bubble and come up. Okay.
I'll complement that private sector example with a public sector example. I work on something at the NHLBI called the National Centers for Accelerated Innovation, as well as a sister program called REACH, R&D commercialization hubs, where we're funding, rather than that, John, you were noting that in your academic progress, you're like the scholar monk who has to be the sole advocate for a particular idea. The notion is to build together a hub of universities. They're all multi-university, although geographically focused programs, and to provide an ecosystem of, with grants, you grease it with money, where the universities are putting in half the money, NIH puts in the other half on a project-by-project basis, where the innovators compete to get the funding, to get the grant, typically for a preclinical to proof of concept program, but they're giving us a whole slew of support services as well, in terms of IP coaching, regulatory coaching, and ultimately market access and health economic coaching as well. Ideally, to end up with assets that are more investable, whether in the private investment or strategic community. So that's a way of NIH taking its historical, we provide non-dilutive funding for basic cancer and translating it further to getting it to the precipice of that fundable level after the valley of death.
And I'll very briefly interject before you go on to the other panelists that, we heard from just the previous speaker that academic institutes, are starting drug discovery screening groups within academia that are aligned to at least go down that road. And it's very interesting to see the pressures that academic institutes are facing in terms of getting grant money, where they are now actually turning their attention into these kinds of initiatives. And to me, this is excellent because they are thinking translation all the time, which is what the bottom line should be. And not withholding that we need to invest in basic research and understanding how a fruit fly does what it does or what a yeast does what it does. Very important to do that, but also to pay attention to what is potentially translatable.
So you've had to be innovative, I presume.
There are two things that the space industry does very well that we used as sort of key points when we were working with single-cell sequencing and really bringing that into the market and beyond, right? Which was, one, long-term thinking, not short-termism, right? So what are we going to be as a species in 50 years, and then work backwards? Space industry is really good about that, right? That's also why they're able to capture mind share and funding. So that's the one thing we did with single-cell sequencing. How are we going to do? What do we want? What do we want the picture of a cell and the individual single-cell understanding of disease to be 50 years from now? And let's work backwards, and how can we get there? The other thing is design thinking. So when we do design thinking, we start with the pain points and the problems, and we try to figure out how you can address those and build value around that, right? As opposed to starting where we do, which is we have a cool molecule and we move forward, right? Instead of working backwards from what are the pain points within treatment. So within that, so to use a real example, we started an exploration with Illumina and then the Broad Institute, really over a 5-month period where we went in and tried to figure out what the pain points are. Who's touching this data? What's impossible now? Who wants to be analyzing this? What do we all bring together? And then, so that was that. But then how do we innovate around that? Generally speaking, it's bringing the right people together and then removing the cooks that don't need to be there anymore, and having the smartest people in the room attack a whiteboard and come up with the key enabling innovations for that. And then you go out and sanity check it with the people who are the experts. Does this make sense? So we did that, and that's a really, you sort of have to breathe heavily, but you go back to the experts, the key opinion leaders at the Broad, and you go, this is what we're thinking, and this could be crazy. It's a risky moment, right? And then they say, oh, that's it. But one of the keys there is that when you are doing the design, it is your job and it is the value that you bring to create that piece of innovation, right? And I think far too many companies sort of talk to customers too frequently throughout that process. And generally speaking, a customer is describing their problem and they don't really know what they need to solve it, right? And that's where we come in and we have to provide that innovation. But it's that moment that you get, the aha moment of, yes, that's what I wanted to do the whole time. And how you actually capture that is really important. But there's very good thought around design thinking. We don't do any of it in science now around how you attack a problem. Right. So those are the two things that we took out.
So Kuldeep, you gave us kind of an idea of the J&J kind of innovation center from a EIR or from a investment perspective. What do you guys want to see coming out of an innovation center that actually captures your interest to then either want to step in and be the CEO or to fund it, right? So what are those kind of quintessential de-risked aspects of an elevator pitch that really catches you?
Certainly. One, I've got to believe that the need is real and identifiable / addressable.
So this comes back to, we want to get to the moon.
Right.
These are the ways we're going to get to the moon, right? And that's the real need. And you need to be convinced that going to the moon is the real need. Correct.
That is the real need. And in this case, given that we're talking about patients, that you can identify them in some meaningful way, in a targeted way. I totally agree with the last speaker, the notion of, a statin for cancer is just absurd. It's going to be all about what's your micro slice of patients where you provide killer value.
So this
And
gets
can you
back to
identify-
Paul's, if we have a $100 million or a $200 million market and our cost of goods is, relatively innocuous, then go for it.
Sure. If you
So
can
that's-
identify
so-
those.
so just-
But can you identify the
Right,
slice of
right.
$200 million?
Yeah, I mean, I think True North was a good example. So there's gluten disease. There's like 7,400 patients worldwide on a per year basis that get this disease. That company sold for $400 million because they could identify them.
Because
They had a compound that person then needed to stay on for the rest of their life, but it actually completely functionally cured the disease.
Yeah.
Right? So
That's a nice business.
And,
Yeah.
and things, things have really turned around in that space too. I mean, Vertex is another great example of what you can do if you focus, admittedly, on the most common genetic rare disease, but on rare diseases. And there are mechanisms available, and I mean, I'm in the United States, right? So things like SBIR grants from the NIH to fund small companies and people trying to establish companies built around a technology or potentially around a therapeutic. At NCATS, we have a branch called the Therapeutics for Rare and Neglected Diseases program that partners with small businesses and pharma to develop therapeutics that might not be economically feasible. And I think something that's changed in the last 5 years is that people have worked out you can basically price something at any price you need to recover your investment. So that drive is going away a little bit, but there's opportunities there, and places like government and pharma are trying to help focus on smaller market opportunities that are just as easily addressable now.
You talk about innovation, though. I just wanted to chime in one point. It was very interesting, and that is, and I think maybe for the audience as well, if you're going to run a company and you're going to be an entrepreneur, really think about the incentives. Think about the incentives. People will follow their nose, whatever incentive you put in front of them. If you put the wrong, even though well-meaning incentive in front of them, they'll go in a completely wrong path, and you'll be very disappointed with the results, and you'll wonder why they're behaving that way. It's because of what you did.
So can you define that more?
Yeah.
Can I define that better?
Yeah, I mean, give an example.
Oh, absolutely. I was talking to a friend of mine. I will not mention who she is. She runs a very large tech transfer program for a major university this morning. And she admitted that one of the problems that they had with negotiating agreements was that even until today, what that university is doing is it is incentivizing their tech transfer officers by rewarding the amount of upfront milestone payments that they receive. So they don't do a lot of deals because all these small companies can't afford the milestone payments. So if you incentivize those officers to get big milestone payments up front, that's all they're going to negotiate. That's how they're rewarded. If, on the other hand, you reward them with getting deals out, and upfront milestone payments has nothing to do with it, you get a completely different outcome. So this is true across the board.
And which is more valuable?
What's that?
Which is more valuable in the long run?
Well, then it depends on what results you want to achieve. And so what I argued was that the results you want to achieve is because this institution is funded with public money, all of our taxpayer dollars, thank you very much, that the ultimate goal should be getting all of this invention dusted off. Because remember, technology invention is a diminishing resource over time. It's not an asset that builds value, it goes away. So the quicker that you can get this into the public realm and give someone like a JLab-sponsored company a chance to do something with it, the better you have a chance to collect a royalty stream on the back end.
So what would you guys all rather do? A series of relatively small value deals, say 10 of them, versus one blockbuster, right? Where do you see, what would you rather do, and what actually provides greater kind of return on investment to the people involved and to the patients that you're ultimately trying to serve?
I think you need to define precisely what you're investing in. If you're investing in a compound that's very close to the clinic, that has a different value proposition. Okay, if you're coming way, way early, that's completely different. It's usually cheaper, but it's high risk. And then the question becomes, how do you balance that? But from a pharma perspective, and I think this is important for entrepreneurs to appreciate, from a pharma perspective, it's what is of strategic interest. That's going to drive, what you're going to pay, and what you're going to pay for what's at a specific stage of development.
And what's your strategic window?
And so it's a pretty long question about strategic window, strategic interest, and what we invest on, what is sometimes off strategy that we invest on. What it comes down to it is that if we feel, for example, in Johnson & Johnson, unlike perhaps other pharmaceutical companies, we work on fewer diseases and we have deep, deep expertise on those diseases. Unfortunately, rare disease isn't one of those diseases that we work on. And the reason is, I think, to what was discussed earlier in the panel, is that we want to have that connectivity to what the unmet clinical need is, that's driving the commercial value, and how to bring that back.
But
all
you
the way
don't
to
necessarily
discovery.
have to have blockbuster,
Sorry?
Deals at the end. That can be a $100, $200 million market niche.
It could be, but we are fundamentally focused on strategically to make sure, for example, for prostate cancer, that we have the next prostate cancer drug. We hope it's a blockbuster, okay? But we want to remain experts in that area and define that unmet clinical need and the biology that's driving it, okay? I mean, there were some very exciting news about prostate cancer with, one of our drugs, Zytiga, that was disclosed at the ASCO meeting, where you're going into early disease. Okay? So I think, to go back to your answer, what you're paying, what type of a deal do you want to do? One deal with, that's huge versus multiple small one depends. It's very dependent on the case by case.
It's a moving target.
Yep, it's a moving target.
All right, so I think we've got a few minutes left.
Sorry to interrupt, John. Oh, you're absolutely right. So I was just recommending probably it might be good to open the floor up to questions.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and lively discussion. My name is Eugene Chandra. I'm an oncology fellow at Johns Hopkins and also CEO of a small startup. And having really worked in a bunch of places all over the world, Oxford University, Sloan Kettering, now Hopkins, NIH, one of the things that you're getting at is the concentric wall of silos that we erect in the whole field of science between institutions, startup accelerators. Everything is a silo in a sense. What you're getting at between the whole discussion, if I'm correct, but I'd like a little bit more insight, is the idea of what the incentives are. And that being said, the idea of the tragedy of the commons comes to mind. You're kind of talking about rational self-interest versus enlightened self-interest, and the question of how we apply that in science. Because I've been to a lot of talks that have discussed this. I've sat with Eliezer Houni, and we've discussed this. And that has been a constant issue of how do we apply enlightened self-interest to the entire field of medicine. Because I'm on the wards all the time, currently on the wards. And there is a lot of repetitive, a lot of non-enlightened self-interest, but rational self-interest that seems to come up over and over and over to the point where you're like, maybe I should just slam my head into a wall. But how do you all see that as being a way to break through that issue? Thank you.
Anybody want to take that one?
I mean, all I can say is that all you can do is lead by example to some degree. I mean, I think that and find common-minded people to build the kind of teams and the kind, I mean, you said you've got a small business that you lead, and try and find like-minded organizations that pursue that. Because, I mean, multiple people said here that it's all about money. And I don't think that's true for everybody. I work somewhere where I'm paid for it not to be about money. In fact, they pay me not a lot to make sure that it's not about money. That's how they sort of select that population. But those environments do exist, and I think it's about finding people who think the same way as you. I mean, you're not going to drag what must be an almost $1 trillion industry. Is it? It probably is almost $1 trillion industry from a discovery point of view to that table necessarily. But you can find the right people. And I mean, I talked about rare neglected diseases, and that's a great example. Where there are partner organizations who are always interested in that. I mean, there's a foundation for nearly every disease, and there are patients that are connected with those foundations, and there are people that lead those foundations that care about translating to therapeutic success.
And you work at Hopkins, you've worked at all these other organizations that are, in some cases, have large walls, moats, silos, figuratively, around them. The people who are most successful in those organizations are the ones who completely ignore those walls and will just say, I don't see this wall, I don't care what your title is, here's what I need, here's what I want, are completely willing to accept no a dozen times in order to get to yes. And that's really a rare attribute, frankly, right? 2 or 3 no's, and people say, I'm just going to go back into my cave and get get into my bench again. So I think that's a really important attribute for success when you're working in big industries, in organizations that have these silos. And you see it, I don't care whether it's academia, pharma, biotech, you see it anywhere.
Okay, I'm sorry we're short of time. If I had the chance, and I think everyone here can agree, we'll probably listen to the panel all day long. I think you've all addressed some key issues facing us, and I hope you, the attendees, can really take on this topics, digest it, and discuss among yourselves. So at this point, this concludes the Research and Innovation panel, and I'd like you, as the audience, to please thank our panelists and our moderator for such a great discussion.